The No Nonsense Roundtable. It's a weekly show broadcast on Rochester, New York's 50,000-watt iHeart radio station, News Radio Wham 1180. The host, Dom Geneva, interviews guests from all walks of life, all with amazing stories to tell. What you are about to hear is a recording of a previous broadcast with limited commercials. Now, here's host Dom Geneva.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of your No Nonsense Roundtable. I'm Dom Geneva, your host every Saturday, 10 o'clock right here. And like I like to remind you, all our past shows are on NoNonsenseRoundtable.com. Now, if this show is about people you know that you should know more about and people you don't know you should know, I have a guest here, Fredrik deBoer, who wrote a book, and you should know him, but you should also buy his book. Nita and I have read his book, and it is prophetic. Well, I guess you should say it was prophetic because the title of the book is How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. And after we went through what we did with this election, I think there are lessons that Fredrik was teaching back when he wrote the book. He is spot on with some of the things that you might have suspected in the back of your mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fredrik. And Fredrik, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Dom.
Now, the question I always like to ask: did you have a straight path in life, or did you always want to be a writer and author?
No, I had a very weird, tangled path. I don't know that I knew that I wanted to do anything when I was 10 years old. And I think pretty much the entirety of my adult life has been, negotiating a better outcome once one of my plans fell through. I'm lucky enough that has put me in a place where I'm quite happy in life. But no, I was always the opposite of having a clear plan kind of a guy. I was always the no plan guy.
So what did you start out doing? What was your first paid gig job? What was it, writing something or?
No. I mean, when I was a teenager, I started lifeguarding for money. And then I lived in Chicago for a couple of years, and it was great, but I was broke. I walked dogs. I used to paint pools and racquetball courts for the YMCA. For a little while, when I moved back to Connecticut in my late 20s, I was the Connecticut State Department of Environmental Protection had come up with a character called Philip D. Bagg, who was supposed to teach children about the importance of recycling paper. And I would put on a fiberglass and cloth mascot costume and go to state fairs and things like that and hand out literature about why it's important to recycle paper. So I've done a lot of that weird stuff. There's a long period of my life where I just found jobs on Craigslist, sort of like little day gigs.
Yeah.
One day I showed up at this old lady's house she had a little farm, and I showed up at 8 a.m. and I just carved pumpkins and took out the seeds for making pumpkin seeds until 10 o'clock at night. I just sat there with my hands aching because it was so cold out the whole time. So yeah, I've done a lot of stuff.
So you sound like someone who does whatever you have to do to get to get by.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the best laid plans of mice and men, right? It's just to me, if I could implant, my wife is pregnant with our first kid coming in April, and I think if there's anything I could implant on him, it's just the most important thing is, how do you swerve when what you were planning doesn't work out, right?
Absolutely. The thing I call it is pivoting.
Mm-hmm.
Pivoting. I mean, even if you look at a company, IBM used to be the number one manufacturer of desktop computers in the 80s. They pivoted, right? And then you take a look at Apple. Apple pivoted. Kodak did not pivot.
Right.
Kodak, we're here in Rochester. They could have had the world by the tail if they only paid attention to digital. So
yeah.
No, that's great. And now this is not the first book you've written either. Tell us about the other ones.
Yeah, so my first book was called The Cult of Smart, and it's an argument about we have a whole American sort of meritocratic system that's based on the idea that the way you get the American dream as you work hard in school and you go to college and you get a fancy degree and then you go and you get a job at Google or somewhere. And the book is a big argument that a lot of people are not suited for that kind of lifestyle or don't want that kind of lifestyle. And we have lost a vocabulary for how to talk about a successful life, an enviable life, a secure life that does not run through that sort of like a student sort of system, that we need to rebuild an economy in which there's more different ways for people to succeed. And I think that connects to what we were just talking about, right? We want to create systems as a society in which there's lots of different outs, right? Where there's lots of different paths in which people can take, because life is funny and we all have different kinds of skills, and we should try to celebrate as many different kinds of skills as we can.
I totally agree with you, because we have, at least in my opinion, gotten to the point where we honor people with degrees, and we sort of have gotten away from honoring people who do things with their hands and intellectually maybe are not academically gifted. I'm not academically gifted, but I do have other talents. Mm-hmm. And when a child, in particular, my last show we talked about this, when a child is not going to college, we kind of Johnny's not going to college. Mm-hmm. You know, but on the other hand, there's so many different paths in life. I call it every once in a while I get a chance to give a talk at RIT, and I call it, what's the currency of your life? If the currency of your life is literally currency, then you got a problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say in the book is, look, like I am very much a product of the sort of academic industrial complex. I have a PhD, and my father was a professor, and his father a professor, et cetera. So I don't denigrate that lifestyle. But if you've been in the system, the college system, as long as I have, I mean, I have worked at colleges and universities for a large portion of my life, you can see that those systems are straining from taking kids who don't want to be there. Mm-hmm. And that's just not a good use of resources for anybody. When I was teaching at the University of Rhode Island, I remember having a conversation with a kid there, and he was very low effort. And I said, hey, what's the deal? Like, why, and he said, I don't want to be here. And I said, well, why are you here if you don't want to be here? It's college, it's voluntary. And he said, what else am I going to do? And his father was a fisherman, and the Rhode Island fishing industry is in constant decline. And so the path that his father had didn't exist anymore. And so I was in a situation where I had to educate a kid who didn't want to be there. And I just knew, like, this is not good for either of us. So it's better for everyone to have more of these paths. Like in Germany, for example, where they've worked really, really hard to build an industrial path for people who want to follow it.
Well, it boils down to the word I use is marketable skill. You can be very educated, but not have a marketable skill.
Right.
And so that was you say that was your first book?
Yeah, that was my first book. And then the second one is the one we're talking about today, How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement.
And we're almost ready. Believe it or not, we're almost ready to head into a break. But How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. Now, let's talk before we get into the break. A little retail here. How do we buy one of these books?
You can pick it up anywhere books are sold. Amazon is an option if that's a company that you like. If you go to my website, fredrikdeboer.com, it's just my name.com, there is a little sidebar where you can click, and it will take you to a site where there's lots of different options for where to buy. It includes an option where you can purchase the book from a independent bookseller if that's your preference. So, but yeah, people ask me a lot, like, what's better for me if it's ebook or audio book or paper book, and I always just say, so long as you read it, I don't care.
That's good. Well, we're going to head into a bit of a break here, and then we're going to come back in a second. This is Dom Genova from Myers Creative. People get DNA tested to see where their ancestors came from, and that's all you get, where they came from. How about if you could actually have a video of past family? Well, you can't do that for the past, but you could do it for the future. John Myers can visit your home and video a professional and thoughtful interview for you to pass down to generations. Book one for yourself or give one as a Christmas gift to mom and dad to talk about their story. Or both. Go to lifeinterviews.com. This is Dom Genova for my friends at Martin Icing Dry Cleaning in Fairport. Well, it's that time again. You're starting to wear long sleeve shirts. You got to schlep them to the dry cleaner and schlep them. Well, no, you don't. No, you don't. You do what I do. You call Martin Icing Dry Cleaning in Fairport. They pick them up and they drop them off, and they do a great job. Their Google rating is 4.9 out of 5. You can, oh my God, it's amazing. Their number is 425-4242. 425-4242. I use them. You should use them. We're back talking to Fredrik deBoer about Boer, right?
deBoer, yeah.
deBoer. I'm so bad with pronouncing names. That's why I barely passed French in high school. The book is How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. So I'll let you explain this in just a sentence or two, and then we'll get a little bit more into the weeds with the details.
Yeah. So the sort of impetus for writing the book is simply the fact that, I have to constantly sort of fight for this fact, but I have, generally kind of ordinary lefty beliefs. I get yelled at by liberals a lot, and I say, well, look, like, name an issue that we disagree on, right? I'm pro-choice. I'm someone who cares about the environment. I think that a sensible immigration policy would involve bringing more people in legally because of, among other things, America is a graying nation, and et cetera, et cetera. We need more people paying into Medicare and into Social Security. But I think that my objections are about process, about how we talk and how we argue and how we advocate for what we want. And in my experience, those arguments are the really bitter ones when you agree on ends, but you disagree about the means. The book sort of takes a look at the sort of 2020s, like 2010s, late 2010s, 2020s moment, early 2020s moment, and says something's gone badly wrong here. I think that the way that the left is talking to the rest of our society is not productive and is not bringing people into conversations in a way that is effective. And I think that the fundamental reason why is, if you look at the history of the left, if you go back 100 years ago, right, you had this really broad American labor movement that was extremely effective, that won all kinds of things like the weekend, the 8-hour workday, all kinds of workplace protections. Then they did it by being a working class led movement, right? It was actually, look at the Pullman strike, which was a famous strike against a railroad car manufacturer. The leaders were the workers. And the problem right now is we have this broad divide between the people who talk about the interests of the worst off and the people who are the worst off. And we need to identify the ways that the elites get it wrong. And that's what the book is all about.
Well, what I see, if I was to paraphrase what I got from the book, is that a movement starts that is, in concept, is worthwhile. Black Lives Matter. I mean, Me Too. It's a worthwhile cause, and then people that aren't necessarily recipients of the benefit of this cause are running the cause,
right?
And I think it's almost human nature. So some of it is the I say the worst law of all is the law of unintended consequences. You start out with something and then you end up with something else, and then it goes through this cycle where it ends up being nothing what it started out to be.
Yeah, and on top of the law of unintended consequences, I would put the tragedy of good intentions, right? Because what I have to tell people all the time is a lot of the people that I'm critiquing have the best of intentions, but that's, the problem is that they're caught up in systems that make them incapable of sort of seeing what's going wrong here. So my favorite chapter in the book is about what I call the nonprofit industrial complex. So if you look at like the progressive world, the lefty world, some of the most powerful institutions are these nonprofit organizations, right? And having nonprofit organizations isn't bad in and of itself, right? But there's really bad incentives. So I tell the story. Actually, I didn't tell the story. I left this out of the book because we couldn't clear it through legal. But when I was researching this chapter, I found these two nonprofits that were devoted to the cause. Like the original thing that sparked them and what they were fundraising on was the eradication of smallpox.
Okay,
and they still exist. and they're still taking donation money, right? And if you're, for anyone at home who's not aware, smallpox was eradicated in the wild in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And you say, well, that's strange. Why would they still exist? Well, what they've done is they've kind of rebranded. They just say, well, we were about smallpox before, but now it's about health, right? It's something nice and vague, which means that they can keep taking in the money and they can keep giving people the tax write-off, even though their actual purpose is very, hard to define. And that's a core problem with this whole thing with the nonprofit industrial complex is whatever they say their purpose is, their mission is, their first mission is always to keep existing.
Right.
Their first mission is always to keep the donations coming in so that they can continue to employ the people. One of the things that I say in the book is that, these organizations become black tie dinner factories, right? They're forever throwing these fancy galas for their donors because that's how you get the donations. And then you spend the donations on the galas and you see the problem, right? They become so invested in self-perpetuation that they end up having very little to do with their actual goal.
Right. And in someplace in the book, you were talking about, the concept of you're in a bureaucracy, you have a job, your job is of a diminishing or negligible value. It really should be done away with, but you're not going to go to your boss and say, do away with my job.
Yeah.
There's a book that was written in the 60s. It's Up the Organizations by Robert Townsend, who used to run Avis. Now you're too young to remember, but back in the 60s when Avis, we're number 2, but we try harder. Okay, yeah. So he wrote this book. He said there was a fella or there was a job for somebody to be on the White Cliffs of Dover and look across the channel and warn people if Napoleon started coming over with his navy, and the job was done away with in 1952.
Mm-hmm.
I mean. Yeah. So it's like the firemen the other thing was you used to be able to have a fireman on a diesel locomotive, and the fireman was supposed to be the guy that shoveled the coal. Yes. So yeah, I see this. The other thing I see, I see that there's a lot of organizations. You get a Chamber of Commerce, and all of a sudden the Chamber of Commerce, you appoint somebody to be the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and then their job is to perpetuate the Chamber of Commerce.
Look at it this way. Let's say you're the vice president of a company, right? And a vice president is a big deal. You're a poobah and you're respected and you have your own parking space, et cetera, right? And let's say that so you have your own division that you look over, and that's gives you prestige and status, and let's say that you as the vice president become aware of the fact that your division is actually redundant, that you could really easily fold it into some other departments, that you could slash a ton of what you're doing and sort of redistribute a few of the people in a few other places, and it would save the company a lot of money. A thing to understand is that human beings don't do that, right? Like we do not go to the board of trustees and say, hey, my division that I'm in charge of, it's redundant, let's get rid of it, right? And you can sort of say that's bad character if we don't, but we just don't, right? Like we can't expect people to do that. So you have to build robust institutions that are honest with themselves about the fact that people are always going to do what's best for themselves in the institution instead of what's best for the institution. Right. So how do we have checks and balances that sort of make this work? In the nonprofit world in particular, the way that you make people who donate think that you're doing something is you hire. It's just what you do. If you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, I think the actual goal of reducing police violence, et cetera, was very noble. But the way that it actually ended up happening was, okay, a lot of people want to give money because that's the only way that they know how to help anything. They give money to a bunch of nonprofits, and the nonprofits say, well, what do we do with all this money? And so they just hire people. And they say, hey, look, we've got a new person who's devoted to this or that task, but there's no reality check about whether they're actually doing anything.
We'll be talking more about this right after this. This is Dom Genova from my friends at Jack Greco Furniture. Like I like to say, you buy a car every couple of years, you probably take your money and put it into furniture for, decades. Now, go someplace where they treat you right and they have good stuff. Not like these big box stores. Go to Jack Greco. And this is the end of the year. They have closeout savings on their outdoor furniture.
Hey, the winter's not going to last forever. It's going to seem that way, but it's not going to last forever. Go see Jack Greco. Welcome back. We're talking with Fredrik deBoer. He wrote this book about how the social justice system was, taken over by the elites.
Well, let me ask you a question, because your book, and like I said, I think everybody should buy this book, is How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. The social issues that were on people's minds, it was on the plate of things that you were considering looking at or whatever with the election. It seems as though it kind of turned out exactly the way you were expecting it to turn out. I mean, on Wednesday morning, you weren't surprised, were you?
No. I mean, one point that I think has to be hammered home is what happened on that day on Tuesday has been happening all over the Democratic world, right? Mm-hmm. And if your viewers are unaware, establishment parties, right? Incumbent parties have been taking it on the chin for years. And what's really interesting is that's been true of both liberal and conservative parties. That if you look across in England and Germany and South America, just all over the world, in Japan, the parties that are in charge have been getting thrown out on their ass, right? Mm-hmm. The voters have been coming in and saying, we're not happy with the way things are. And it's really interesting to try to say, wow, we think of politics as being so local in particular, but something is making it be the case that people in southern Pennsylvania and people in northern Japan and people in central France are all kind of feeling this impulse to say, whatever we got now is not working. We got to throw it out.
Throw it out.
Yeah. And there's just, my political life has been dominated by the sense of like elite consensus. So that like you had things like the World Bank and you had things like the UN and you have like the sort of foreign policy consensus, whatever. I think it's all cracking up right now, right? Like globalization, which, one of the first things that I can remember as a politically conscious teenager was the debate about NAFTA and, Bill Clinton saying, oh, we won't lose any jobs. We're not going to lose any jobs because of NAFTA, right? Because that was the consensus. That was the sort of elite consensus. And I think that one of the things you're seeing across the world is like people sort of saying, this is not working for me. This is not the life that I had bargained for. The establishment governments don't speak in my language, and we're going to throw them out on their ear. And I think it's going to be a really interesting decade to come.
Well, I think some of it with the social movement, too, is people talking down at you.
Oh, for sure.
It's very, very hard to have I think I said it before, have somebody yell at you and saying you're not engaged enough and you don't care enough or whatever. One of the philosophies I have, there's a difference between fault and responsibility. Mm-hmm. And my personal, I am not at fault for a lot of the things that are wrong with this country. That happened years ago. The die was cast many generations before I'm here. But it's still my responsibility to work on those things.
Yeah.
So, and I think we have gotten into this pointing a finger at one another and saying it's your fault. It's your fault. You have this privilege. You did this, or your tribe is like this or like that, and it's just polarizing. It's the thing. It's like I had David K. Johnston on my show a couple of weeks ago, and some people are very, very upset that I had David K. Johnston on. Well, he's got his opinions. It's not my job to argue with this guy and say, well, this and that and the other thing, and you're wrong, or whatever. You have to listen to the individual. But the people that told me they heard half the show and they hung up on him, I mean, I talk about counterproductive. That's counterproductive. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. Here's the question that I have too, is that this whole thing, I guess Nixon called it the silent majority, this underpinning of people that were so upset with the way the world is, that they voted for Donald Trump, but would not admit that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, I think this is almost like, nobody says they drink too much or they watch stuff on the internet that you shouldn't watch. How were all the pundits and the pollsters, how are they all so wrong with this?
I mean, I think one thing that we should observe right away is that there are no political blowouts anymore, right? Like Trump won. He won all 7 swing states. He's going to win the popular vote. So, I mean, he clearly was the victor, but he's not going to get to 50% of the vote, right? Like he's going to tap out. I'm short of 50% of the popular vote, and that's just the way that politics is now. Even George W. Bush in 2004. In the Electoral College, he pretty handily beat John Kerry, but he won by 2%, maybe. And this is totally different from how it used to be. I remember, when Bill Clinton came in and he won pretty handily in 92 and 96, that was seen as this big upset because, in 84, I mean, before I could remember, but in 84, Walter Mondale won a single state, right? Yeah. Like one state, right? Yeah. And that was not that unusual. I mean, obviously that was a pretty big blowout, but you could go back 20 years earlier to Barry Goldwater, I think won 3 states, maybe, We're just not in that era anymore. And so the first thing to say is like, nobody should be certain about anything in this scenario, right? That's like, true. Like everything is so tuned up just to, I think that they got it wrong because, again, it gets back to this question of what pundit is going to make a career by saying, well, I don't know, right? Who's going to have a successful media career saying, it's a tight election. I don't know. The way that they make their bones is by saying this is going to be a blowout for the Republicans or the Democrats, right?
Right.
And you can go through and you can find, I mean, look, like anyone who said that it was going to be a Trump blowout is pretty much as wrong as someone who said it was going to be a Harris blowout, because again, he's not even going to get to 50% of the vote, right? Like, we're on this razor edge, and we're in a situation where every presidential election is extremely close, and that's just not good for the pundit careers of people who want to get attention by saying extreme things. You will remember that there was a pollster who said that Iowa was going to be won by Harris by 7 points, or something like that, or 3 points or something, and Trump took Iowa by 13 points. Yeah. She retired. She literally retired after the election, right? But it's like the incentive is always to overestimate your confidence.
Yeah.
And whether you're on the left or the right. And, and that's just not a good match with an era defined by very, very tight elections.
We'll be right back after this. This is Dom from my friend Jim Shelley and his Fanatics Pub and Blues Stage in Lima. We talk all the time about the great blues shows he has, and his patios open on weekends for free entertainment. Jim also has the Bills game on every Sunday. You can go there and watch the Bills in a setting that's more like, well, Cheers than a big and personal sports bar. Exit 10, Route 390, go east a couple of miles and you're there. I'll be there. Come say hello. Well, welcome back. We're talking to Fredrik deBoer, who wrote this fascinating book on how the elites, as he calls it, ate the social justice system.
So one of the points of your book, and let's get back to this, the concept about the elites. So it's sort of, so the elites kind of co-opted these things. I mean, in your mind, am I explaining that correctly?
Sure.
No, you had a ground roots movement. I mean, and I'll just, I mean, when Martin Luther King was doing his deal, it was a ground roots movement. It didn't get co-opted by somebody else. Right. Am I right about this? And this is what's different now, is that these movements have been co-opted by people that don't have their own stake in the game. Is that
and I want to be clear, sort of up front, that like, look, Martin Luther King Jr. was himself was like an elite in the terms that I'm talking about. He was very educated. He had been groomed for this position for many years. Rosa Parks, we usually think of her as just like a lady who was tired and didn't want to give up her seat on the bus, but she was actually a very well-trained activist who had sort of done this sort of, with the blessing of a group, whatever. The difference is that like, nothing was more important for the civil rights movement, especially in the early days, than the organizations that were enabled by the Black church. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why the civil rights movement was very successful in the early 1960s is because they had this already existing infrastructure of Black churches that they could use for organizing, for getting out the vote, for publicity, etc. Right? So they had this network of ordinary people that they were always able to sort of deploy for this purpose. If you look at, again, go back to the American labor movement. If you went to a union meeting in Detroit at any time in the first half of the 20th century, you had people who were mostly or almost universally didn't have college educations, but they had the union hall as a space where they could trade ideas and they could talk, and politicians would go to the union hall and make their pitch, and there was organization, whatever. Those organizations for the left largely don't exist anymore, mm-hmm. right? And what organizations do exist are organizations that pull in people, again, like me, right? So again, to be clear, I am one of these pointy-headed elites with a PhD in whatever. It's people whose attachments and connections are primary intellectual and academic mm-hmm. and professional, rather than having these organic, already existing networks that exist. Look, you go to war with the army you have, right? Like mm-hmm. the old Dick Cheney line or Donald Rumsfeld line.
Rumsfeld, yeah.
Yeah. And it's not like I think people should just give up on the sort of organizing that's happening now. It is just a major, major impediment to the modern left of center, that the labor movement is a shell of what it once was. Less than 10% of American workers are in unions now. That, the church, again, like not just the Black church, but the church in general, the Quakers, the sort of the Unitarian Universalists, the Congregationalists, they were always key parts of sort of left organizing, but there's been a significant decline in religiosity in church attendance, so that's sort of taking it down. We have to find some way to rebuild, sort of bottom-up grassroots organization, because it doesn't just give you the benefits of organization, it gives you credibility.
Mm-hmm. So last couple of seconds here. So the point of your book, tell me what you would want people to take away from your book ultimately.
I would say that I would want them to just think about the distinction, right, mm-hmm. between inside and outside. So we can have values that we share and care about, but we also have to understand that those values are useless if they don't appeal to other people. Mm. I would also just really like for people to think like, okay, are the structures that we've put into place actually serving the causes we care about? I really do think Black Lives Matter was a perfect example, which is that you have a really horrific event and you have a very deeply moral cause, and then you have a lot of people who want to do good and don't know how to do good, and then you have like all this stuff that just feels like doing something, right? A lot of people gave away a lot of money that went nowhere and did nothing, right? Billions of dollars was donated, and it seems like a ton of it sort of went to hiring well-meaning 22-year-old Black college graduates who now have paper-pushing jobs at nonprofits that don't do anything. Mm-hmm. And I guess there's worse things to do with money, but there's also better things to do with them. And yeah. The process through which intent and action and community focus becomes change on the Democratic side has broken. There is this whole world of structures in place that break down for no reason.
And pretty much you're saying a lot of it is dictated top down rather than bottom up.
Yeah, it's It's so funny because it's like, the tradition of the left has been about like rejecting the structures through which we sort of live hierarchies of power, but like we don't know how to do anything that's not okay. You work your ass off in college and then you go to Stanford and then that gets you the ability to get into the ground floor of the Ford Foundation and then eventually become a vice president at a nonprofit, right? The point being that like there's a total disconnect between the ideals and between like this sort of American meritocratic system, which does not work for many people, and just sort of creates this self-perpetuating class of people who have the best intentions and then don't do anything.
Yep. A lot of it is human nature, and I don't know how to change it, but you articulated very well in this book how elites ate the social justice movement. I totally recommend everybody read this book. I'm going to put a link on it on nononsenseroundtable.com. You go to Fredrik, Fredrik, deBoer, DEBOER.com, right? And you get a book there, or Amazon, or go. I like the idea of going to your local bookshop to get the book too. And I'm going to go in and order a bunch of books. Can I get these signed from you?
Yeah, absolutely. We can work that out.
I'll contact you and we'll
figure that out.
For me to hand out as thank yous for people that have been on my show. Well, thank you ever so much. This is going to be broadcast on our 50,000 watt radio station here in Rochester. Plus, I'll make a YouTube out of this, and if you could share that, that would help me a lot.
Sounds great. I will. Yeah, just send me the link.
It is a pleasure to have met you because, like I said, Nita and I were so impressed with this book. You are just spot on. And I was laughing my tail off the day after the election. I'm going, he's got it right. He predicted this. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well,
all right. I appreciate it. Yep.
Thanks for being on the show, and the best of luck to you, buddy.
All right. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Tune in every Saturday from 10 to 11 on News Radio Wham 1180. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll make more.